Good afternoon. I'm John Lipsky. I'm the Peterson Scholar at the Kissinger Center for Global Affairs here at SAIS and also a Senior Fellow of the Foreign Policy Institute. And it's my great pleasure and honor to introduce to you today Pierre Moscovici, who is still the Commissioner for Economic and Financial Affairs, Taxation and Customs of the European Union, who has graciously agreed to come and speak with us today. For those who don't know details of Commissioner Moscovici's background, he's the son of a Romanian father and a Polish mother, and has achieved an awful lot in France. So you can say he's lived the American dream in France. Or maybe another way of putting it is there are other places in the world where these dreams can be realized. But Commissioner Moscovici studied economics and philosophy at Sciences Po and then moved on to the esteemed École Nationale d'Administration. In 1986, he joined the Socialist Party and then had a very rapid career. 88, he joined the Ministry of National Education under the Jospin government, soon moved to the French Planning Office, became a Euro MP already in 1994, and by 1997 became the Minister of European Affairs in the Jospin administration. In 2004, he was elected a Vice President of the European Parliament, one of 14, and then in 2007, elected to the National Assembly, where he served on the Committee on Foreign Affairs and on Finance. From 2012 to 2014, he was Minister of Finance under the presidency of the Hollande presidency, and in 2014 was named to the European Commission, a position he's held to this day. And as you, I'm sure, follow things closely, we are waiting for the final approval by the European Parliament of the new Commission. And so in a still uncertain but probably not very long span of time, Commissioner Moscovici's term in Brussels will end. So this is a particularly excellent time for him to be here to reflect on what has transpired over the past years under his membership of the Commission. And we are very, very grateful for the Commissioner not only to come here, but to have arranged the announcement of a deal on Brexit to make the affair today even more interesting. So without further ado, I could call Commissioner Moscovici here. Welcome. So we are going to have a discussion, and then eventually we will open the discussion to you for questions. Where should we start? I suppose it's unavoidable. Brexit. Is this good or bad? Is striking a deal in the end good for the future of the European Union, or is just the fact of Brexit a bad thing?
Well, first of all, I want to thank you for hosting me here. I want to thank especially John for this conversation, John Hopkins for this opportunity to discuss with this very distinguished assembly. And really, for me, an honor and pleasure to do that at the end of my mandate as commissioner. It will happen once. It was supposed to happen the 1st of November. I was expecting that. I already had planned vacation, and so I had to change my agenda because I'm there for at least 1 month. So I don't know how to plan further vacation. I will wait a bit for the process to go on. But it's clear that today we have a Brexit agreement. If I look back in the future, I will say that I still deeply regret. I'm among those who regret the Brexit. I think that we would be much better with the UK in the EU than with the UK out of the EU. That is something that might not be shared by some people. Obviously, it was not shared by the majority of the British people when they voted for Brexit in June 16. But since there has been a referendum, we had, And we did that to respect the vote, sovereign vote of the British people. And so we regret the Brexit, but we accept the Brexit. I think there was at this moment a gigantic illusion or a big lie in a way, because those who proposed Brexit told the people, after all, you're going to vote for Brexit, as if it was going to happen tomorrow. It couldn't happen tomorrow because we have so many treaties, agreements, represents tens of thousands of pages, very complex legislation. We are totally interconnected. There was a need for a long negotiation. This took place because we are 3 years and a half almost after the vote, and the Brexit still did not happen. I'm not going to go back on all the episodes, but I say that in this condition, with this regret, but with this respect, it's much better to strike a deal than to have a no deal, which could have happened, can still happen. It's not yet over, on the 31st of October, after several extensions already, because it could have happened, it should have happened in March 2018, 19 initially. I think that, as my friend and colleague, former colleague, because it was my predecessor in the Commission, Mr. Barnier said, it's a fair and reasonable agreement that is mutually beneficial, again in the context. And so I welcome that, of course, but that's not the end of the story. There is a European Council with the jet lag, I don't know exactly, which is now ongoing, which will end tomorrow. The European Council has to endorse the deal. I imagine it will, because the Commission always negotiated with a mandate from the 27 member states, in close cooperation with that and coordination with that. With them. So I cannot imagine that there is denial. And then there will be, for, I don't know, the first time since the Maldives Wars, a session in the British Parliament on Saturday, which will have to approve the deal. Then I don't know what will happen then. It will be certainly a close vote. It's not an easy discussion. If the deal is not ratified, as you know, there is a bill which has been voted by the Parliament, saying that in this case, after the 19th of October, there would be a new extension of 3 months required. And so, well, that's not the end of the story, but today is a very important day because we have that deal. It's a fair deal, it's a reasonable deal, and I hope that it will be as well endorsed and adopted. Mm-hmm. And if I look at the common interest, it's much better to have a deal than a no deal. A no deal would put us into uncharted territory, would bring a lot of difficulties. I'm the Customs Commissioner. Customs are at the heart of the discussion and the problem. And to have a deal is also the best way to design in the future a very close and affectionate and strong relationship. Because even if it's likely now the Brexit happens, the UK won't be an EU member in this case, but will still be, of course, a European country by everything. So let's look at that.
Mm-hmm. So let's say...
and it's also, sorry to be long,
please.
A factor of uncertainty that will disappear for the future of Europe and also for the world and for the world economy.
Yes. Now, it strikes me that many Americans somehow think that this deal is the deal, the Brexit deal. But of course, this is an agreement for a transition during which a permanent deal is going to be negotiated. So this is going to go on for a while. How long and how difficult do you think this is going to be to finalize a permanent deal with the UK, and how damaging is that uncertainty going to be?
The deal is a deal. So the deal will take place, will be applied as such. Then what we need to negotiate in this transitional period is something different. It's the future relationship between the UK as a third country and the EU as a union. Because you cannot go from today to tomorrow with a full exit. You need also to respect your commitments, and some of them are financial, and they need to be respected. It's very high importance for everybody. And then after that, you need to reflect, for example, on what kind of free trade agreement we can have with the UK. Some in the UK always talk about a free trade agreement with the US. Well, okay, as a country outside of the EU, they will be free to negotiate free trade agreements with whoever they want. But the first free trade agreement that needs to be negotiated is probably with us. And so this transition period is there for that, to design the future relationship between the EU and the UK out of the EU.
Is that process of negotiating a final settlement with the UK going to represent a distraction of importance for the EU in its effort for further integration and structural reform, or is it going to essentially be a side issue for Europe, for the EU, as opposed to the UK, for which it's going to be very critical?
Whatever is the definite outcome of that, Brexit with this deal, or Brexit elsewhere, another way, or even you don't know what could happen at the end of the process, we enter into the money time since there will be clarity. And this clarity will mean, let's imagine there could be a remain. The chances are very weak, and that's not the spirit of what is being signed today. Then you would have an EU at 28. It's likely at, I don't know, 90% and plus that you have a EU at 27. So there will be two kind of works. The first one is to design a relationship with the UK, but the second one would be to reinforce the EU at 27. And so we will need to, I wouldn't say reinvent, but to build a closer cooperation between us. One of the reasons why the British people chose to exit is because they were not fine in the EU. Not all of them, because the country is split, as you know. But so we must be fine together. We must absolutely move to further integration inside the EU at 27, and that all our efforts must be dedicated to that. There cannot be a distraction, but of course it's important for us to negotiate good relationship with a previous member who is an important one, because the UK, as you know, is a permanent member of the Security Council. It's a very close partner by all means, economically, strategically. We are G7 countries, I'm French, G20 countries. They will always be there. They share our values. They are a liberal democracy. And for security, we need to be very close for defense. So, these are two tracks. They are moving in parallel, and they're not contradicting each other.
Excellent. Well, for this discussion, I thought I would take as a guide your title for the Commissioner of Economic, Financial Affairs, Taxation, and Customs. So let's start with the economy. The IMF just released its latest World Economic Outlook, and I'm sure you're very well aware. The forecast, the IMF forecast for this year is a rather tepid 1.2% growth rate for the euro area, including 0.5% for Germany and 0% for Italy, and a recovery to only about 1.4% next year for the euro area as a whole. Is that a disappointment? Is that a surprise? What are the aspects that have caused the slowdown, and what is needed to ensure a rebound?
It's hard to me to comment on another institution's forecast. Not that I think that they're wrong.
You can use your own.
But because I have to release ours.
Yes.
I was supposed, as I said, to leave the Commission on the 1st of November, and that would have avoided me the difficulty to present the forecast on the 7th of November. I told my successor, now it's up to you to do that. Bad luck. Since the Commission is there at least until the 1st of December, I will have to deliver the next forecast, so I cannot give you any kind of secret. Let's say that there is a general tendency which is endorsed by all institutions, and it's quite likely that we won't be very far from the IMF. There is no reason why we see different trends. We might have different percentages here or there, or different analysis, but as you know very well, John, basically we always go in the same way. To answer your question, I will again look at the past. When I took this job in 2014, Jean-Claude Juncker said we are the Commission of the last chance, meaning that we were still in the economic crisis. It was getting in the past, but still, for example, we had to deal with the Greek crisis. This took me a lot of my time because I was the negotiator for Greece. And I cannot forget that as well in summer 12 and in summer 15, we were very, very close to the abyss, which would have been a Grexit, an exit from a country, from the single currency. And let's be clear, that would have signed, in my view, the end of the euro. We were always in favor of the integrity of the euro. And the integrity of the euro was forbidding any kind of Grexit. So we dedicated a lot of energy to that. If I look 5 years after, the situation in Europe is much, much better. I will take all the indicators. First, growth. It's clear that we have a slow growth, but we have growth everywhere in all EU countries. This was not the case until 3 years ago. Second, public finances. Sorry to move to finance,
please go
but
right ahead.
they are obviously linked. Our task was to reduce deficits. The deficits were at 6% in 2010. They are now at 0.8%. They've been divided by almost 10, which is considerable. We've done that without austerity policy. We didn't sanction anybody, neither Italy, Spain, Portugal, or some even thought about my country, France. We did that with an encouragement to growth. We launched a huge investment plan called the Juncker Plan of 500 billion euros. So investment is now picking up. If I look at unemployment, it has been diminishing from some 11% to 7.7%. And finally, if I look at the structural problems linked to our banks, they are much more solid today than they were in the past. We've been creating what we call the banking union. We've reduced the NPL, etc. So let's not look at Europe as the sick man of the world. That's not the case. And you could say also that the forecast of the IMF show mostly a more important slowdown of global growth. And of course, being the most open economy in the world, because that's what we are, with a very strong manufacturing sector, still much stronger than the US. Discussed that yesterday with Jay Powell. It's something like 10% of GDP here. It's over 15 in Europe, not equally everywhere, but that's very important. We suffer more from global slowdown. We are very vulnerable to trade tensions. And this is particularly true for those economies who are the more open. For Germany, you mentioned the figures. For Italy, also, you mentioned the figures. So we are in the present cycle, which is a cycle of slowdown. What we need to do is to consolidate our potential growth, which is too weak. That is to reinforce even more our investment capacities, to invest more in research, education than we did before, training. We certainly need also to concentrate more on climate change. And that's why the new Commission will propose an agenda for a Green New Deal, and that will need considerable funding. We will probably spend trillions of euros on that. And if we do so, we will have at the same time a stronger and maybe more dynamic economy. We lack maybe dynamism, but we are strong. We don't feel vulnerable for the time being. I'm not worried about Europe, but I would like Europe to be, of course, one of the leaders of the world and not to lose ground in the global economy. For that, we need also to solve the global issues. Trade tensions are obviously a threat. We hope that after the, I don't know how to call it, mini agreement or pre-agreement between China and the US, we will have an agreement. Brexit was also a source of uncertainty. So whatever happens, and if the agreement is done specially, we won't have that uncertainty. And that will also be good. And we have also geopolitical tensions, especially in the Middle East, that need to be resolved. And then we've got structural issues. China, the way we deal with China, as a competitor, but also as a partner in the economic field is absolutely decisive.
So in broad terms.
And finally,
yeah, please.
we need to reflect on what will be the next fiscal policy.
Yes.
Because we've been, how could I say, dedicated to reduce deficits. That's a good thing. But we must now think about what we could do or should do in the scheme of a potential slowdown, which would be higher. And I think that there must be a reflection on how those countries with high deficits and debt, namely Italy or in a way France, even if it's quite different on the one hand, and those countries with high surpluses, namely Germany and Netherlands, can have a different approach. When you have a high deficit and debt, you need to reduce it still. When you have high surpluses, you need to use them for investment and for growth.
Mm-hmm. So in other words, in many ways, I guess the message is the European economy certainly has improved substantially from the years of the crisis. And the problems, let's call these the macro problems, are actually not unique to Europe, but rather more common among, as you described, more common among the advanced economies.
We have our specificities, but we are in the global trend, yes, and we are, I would say, more vulnerable to this global trend since we are, again, the most open economy in the world, obviously, and by far.
With a focus on special focus on manufacturing.
Yeah, and there is also a point there about Germany. There is a question mark there, because first, Germany is the strongest economy in Europe. Second, it has the highest surpluses in the world, and that's a problem that is often addressed here in those meetings of the IMF, in G20 meetings, in G7 meetings, etc. And third, this country is now knowing a slowdown that it hadn't met in decades, or 2 decades at least. And there is a question whether this is structural or this is just an adjustment or normalization.
Yeah.
And this will have to find an answer, not in 2 days or 2 weeks, not 2 months, but probably in the next period. My view is that there is something structural there and that it should be thought about.
Yes. Well, there are those who would say the most successful big economy in Europe, Germany, has focused, among other things, on the auto industry. Lots of people building internal combustion engines, lots of people building transmissions, a Mittelstand focusing on machine tools, a kind of apogee of the industrial era. But looking forward, it's hard to think that's the future for economic success.
I couldn't say it better.
Is the responsibility for the improvement basically a national one or a European one? Or both?
It's basically national, but of course the mutation of the EU economy towards a greener economy is something that we must achieve all together. Nobody must forget that the EU as such is a political body, but doesn't have a huge budget, and that national policies are still decisive on all fields. And how to transform a business model for a country also depends on them. If you look at automobile, that's something I know quite well because I've been a politician for quite a long time, and I was elected in the automotive part of France because there are automobiles also built in France. One could say the car industry suffered in Germany because of trade tension on the one hand, and second because they had to adapt to some rules, and some scandals also intervened in environment, etc. But I think that the threat or the limitation might be more structural and long-lasting if you look at the 20 years to come. So it's certainly not prudent to have a model, an industrial model, which relies mostly or only on the automotive sector. But since they are a very important industrial power, they will certainly have the capacity to transform, to adapt. When you have got the industrial skills, you can always be a strong industry. These capacities are not lost.
Are there institutional reforms in the EU that you would like to see that could have an impact not just on Germany, but overall the economic performance of the European economy?
Yes, I will concentrate on my field. I don't think that the time has come for a great change in the EU institutions. On the contrary, we probably missed the opportunity in 2005 when my country, France, refused the constitutional treaty in a vote in June 2005. So there is no appetite for that now, and we are not moving towards a more federal integration. We are not going to have a new constitution for the EU. But we need to have more democracy in the EU. And we'll take two examples. The first one is a proposal that I made when I was finance minister in 2013, that President Macron made as a candidate in his campaign in 2017, and that I feel deeply right, is to create a kind of Minister of Finance for the Eurozone, with a budget for the Eurozone, and with parliamentary control for the Eurozone. That is the only way, first, to have a stronger tool, the budget, to have a kind of accountability, and to have democratic control. I've been a member of the so-called Eurogroup. The Eurogroup is the ministers, the Council of Ministers of Finance for the Eurozone, 19 people. You must imagine that in a room which is not bigger than this one, you've got 19 ministers, plus the commissioner, plus the president of the ECB, Mario Draghi, plus the president of the ESM, which is our financial tool, plus, when we talk about Greece, Christine Lagarde, or the MD of the IMF, whoever he or she is. Okay, 23 people. We have taken huge decisions on Greece, 10 million people. They totally depended on those decisions. I'm not saying that the decisions were wrong. I'm saying the way the decision was not the right one. I call that a democratic scandal. An observation which is sociologic or organization, it tells you that when you take a decision in a closed room and at the open air, it's not going to be the same decision in the end. So that's one reform. The other one is linked to my other hat, is tax. On tax, we will come back on that since you want to follow the different aspects of the portfolio.
We don't have to be so linear.
We've done a lot on fighting tax fraud and tax evasion especially, and we will probably have tonight at the G20 another progress on taxing the digital economy. But there is one limitation to what we can do in the EU on tax. It's the fact that decisions on tax, it's also the case on social affairs, have to be taken by unanimity. That means that everybody needs to agree. In other words, that means that any country, whatever is its size, can veto the will of all the others. That's not a democracy. And as long as we've got that, we cannot have tax harmonization or a strong taxation system. And so my second proposal is also institutional, is to move those items, which are tax and social matters, to qualified majority voting rather than unanimity.
Now, when Wolfgang Schäuble visited SAIS 3 years ago, in his last visit to Washington as Minister of Finance, he endorsed the notion of converting the European Stability Mechanism into a European monetary fund that would have both powers of analysis, surveillance similar to the IMF, but in the Eurozone, and with financing ability like a lender of last resort. Does that sound like a proposition that you would endorse?
Wolfgang Schäuble is a man for whom I've got the greatest admiration and I feel the greatest friendship. We've been finance minister together for 2 years, and he was finance minister for, 3 years in my time as a commissioner, and he's really a great guy. Saying that, you will understand that this introduction means that I'm not in full agreement with him on that matter, neither on other matters. As you said, I'm a social democrat. He's not. He's rather conservative,
Yes,
and that has some implications. I will just take two. One, I already mentioned, is on Greece. Wolfgang thought that the Eurozone would be better without Greece, or that at least temporary, Greece should be exited from the Eurozone. And he said that, or his team said that in July 15, in a quite tragic mode. I always disagreed with that. I always thought, like Mario Draghi, that the integrity of the Eurozone is essential and that Greece should stay inside, not at any conditions, but that they should. On this EMF question, it's a very seductive approach. You know that, having been yourself an acting MD of the IMF, the Europeans would like to have their own fund and not to require the services of the IMF when necessary, which was the case in Greece.
Yes.
So we need to have our own tool. What I disagree is not to have that kind of mechanism. We have strengthened the ESM. Now it's much bigger, with a stronger role, and I welcome that. The ESM, the European Stability Mechanism, which is a tool that has been built during the crisis, will be also a kind of backstop for the single resolution fund that we'll build in order to deal with banks who would fail. So I approve the fact that the role of the ESM is increasing and getting stronger. But if I take Wolfgang's point to the end, that would mean that the ministers would be the board of the ESM, that the ESM would be the only engine that we have, and that it would be purely intergovernmental agreement.
That's correct.
And on that, I don't agree. I think that politics needs still to be there, that you must not be in a one-size-fits-all approach, and that the way it was designed was not the right one, so we disagree.
Yeah. And,
But he knows we disagree.
yeah, and he was explicit as well as saying it would have to be through intergovernmental agreement, not a treaty change.
My view is exactly the contrary, but it's no big surprise. Not because I'm a social democrat and a conservative, because I'm a commissioner. I truly believe in the common three method and in European instruments. And I think that, to be clear, the ESM should become an institution of the EU and should be incorporated in the EU treaty. The way he designed it was exactly the reverse. It was to build a purely intergovernmental instrument, not submitted to our EU rules. And obviously one of his targets was to weaken the Commission because he thought that the Commission was a true political body. I sometimes think that it's not enough. So see, invite us for a discussion next time.
Thank you.
I would do that with great pleasure.
Thank you very much for that.
We've done some discussions.
Yes.
And not only in closed rooms.
Yes, yes. The one notable difference between the U.S. economy and the Eurozone, or the European economy more broadly, is the role of banks. In the U.S., banks are a relatively modest source of new funding for economic activity, and in the Eurozone, banks are the dominant source. How important would it be to, first of all, to complete the banking union? And secondly, how important is the capital markets union process for progress in Europe?
First, as I said in my initial remarks, I truly believe that now our banking sector is much stronger than it was, and that we are ready to address any kind of situation, and that we could face a shock. And why? Because we established that banking union. Banking union, what is it about? Three pillars. First, supervision. We need to know what happens in the banking sector. Then resolution, what to do with a bank that fails. And third, EDIS, which is a deposit insurance scheme to protect the depositors. Supervision is already done. And it's a mechanism which is now embedded in the ECB. It works. And we can say now today that we have no major systemic risk in our banking sector, even if here or there probably some reorganization could happen and probably at one moment will happen. Resolution the principle is decided, and as I said, there the ESM will play a stronger role, since it will be the backstop, the budgetary support of the Single Resolution Fund. So I'm quite convinced that in case we have a problem with the bank, we will be capable of addressing it. EDIS is nowhere, because our German friends don't want it. Again, Wolfgang, but his successor is the same on that. Because of the structure, particular structure of the German banks, I disapprove with that, but that's the case. And but we must insist on that, and I hope it will be on the agenda of the next Commission. So that's for the situation in banking union. Then nobody must imagine, that's my personal view, I'm not Commissioner for Financial Services, that we will move to a financial system or a system of financing which will be exactly the same as the US. Yeah. The financing in Europe will, for a very long period, be intermediated, and our banks will continue to play the stronger role. And this is why we need that banking union, so that they are not weakened or fragile. But of course, we need to increase the role of the markets. And that's what Capital Market Union is about. We started the work in the Juncker Commission. We've launched the work. It needs now to be delivered in the next Commission. I must say that the Brexit there was not a great help, because, well, it created some uncertainty. And one must not forget that the Financial Services Commissioner was my good friend Jonathan Hill, and that when he left, there was a kind of a slowdown. But I think now it needs to be relaunched. Not in order to change the global course, but to modify the equilibrium and to increase the role of capital markets. So the Capital Markets Union must also be a strong priority for the next Commission.
Mm-hmm. Because for now, basically the American investment banks have become really dominant in capital markets. It's been a big change after the crisis.
And we, the Europeans, must be capable of reacting to that.
Yeah. As you can tell, I love this conversation, and I could keep going a long time, but it's, in fairness.
Maybe I can say a word about tax, because you didn't ask me about tax.
I was about to.
You were about. I thought you were about to go. To give the floor.
Go ahead.
No, sorry.
Let's make sure we get that.
No, I wanted to say a word about that, because
please do.
That was a part of my job. That is a part of my job, which was a really great and positive surprise for me. When I became tax commissioner, some told me that is the most boring, unuseful job you can dream of. And I myself, when I was finance minister, my cabinet, or my staff, cabinet is something different in English, came to me and said, Mr. Minister, you should meet the commissioner for tax in the EU. And I told them, do I really need to see him? Well, yes, he has some infringement procedures to discuss with you, or there is a problem of the VAT on horses. I love horses, but still, that's not too decisive. And he was totally blocked, poor guy, by unanimity voting. And then the world has changed. And that's why I wanted to say a specific word there. The world has changed with FATCA, which is American, with BEPS, which is a procedure launched by OECD, with tax scandals, which multiplied, with a crisis and the idea that there is now public opinion saying it's not possible that we citizens, we pay our fair share of tax, while multinationals don't. And with that, and with also the support of the European Parliament, the surprise for me is that I came into a moment where I was capable of having 15 directives voted, 8 against tax fraud and tax avoidance, all at unanimity. And this track record was a total surprise and absolutely unprecedented. We have been doing more, as well on substance and on number, than in the previous 20 years in the history of the EU. And we've changed the course. We are going tonight to have a discussion in G20 on digital taxation. Well, okay, I didn't succeed in having a EU directive, but there is now an OECD process which is going, hopefully, in the right direction. And we will discuss that again with OECD, but they've done a good job in order to create a bridge between the EU, the US, other stakeholders all over the world. Of course, it was not a perfect job because unanimity also blocked me on VAT, on digital, on energy. I've got a regret there. And I think that this effort to have a more harmonized tax system, to continue fighting tax fraud and tax evasion, and to modify the structure of our corporate tax must be pursued in the next Commission. That was just a word of advertisement I wanted to say.
Very good. Okay, to you. Who would like to ask a question? Please raise your hand, and the mic will come to you, and then we'll start over here. Please tell us your name and affiliation, and ask your question, and make sure it's a question and succinct. Thank you.
Okay. Hi, my name is Greg Moore. I'm a fellow here at SAIS in the Foreign Policy Institute, but I work at the University of Nottingham in Ningbo, China. I do China, not Europe, but so I have to ask the China question. I've been watching with interest China's increasing presence in Europe and this new deal with the port of Trieste. And some people, I'm sure here in Washington, many would agree that possibly this Trieste deal could be kind of a Trojan horse economically, not talking about strategic implications, but I'm just wondering how much discussion that's having. Obviously, EU is a sovereign state, they can do what they want, but it has pretty big implications for the whole EU as a whole. So I was curious what you thought about that.
That's a very complex, not question, but issue. China is obviously for us and for the world a major economic partner. And they are also, or first, bringing opportunities in the EU economy. I will say a word, for example, I talked about Greece, the port of the Piraeus, the privatization of the port of Piraeus was won by a Chinese company. The port is now working well. And I'm not always ideologically in favor of privatization, don't understand me. But they bring this opportunity. And at the same time, they are or can be a threat to our sovereignty. And that's why we have just started 2 years ago to have a reflection on the way we must handle the question, especially on asking China to act on its own overcapacities, and also how to defend our strategic investment. And we have delivered what we call a communication in the EU about that. I think we are just at the beginning of this reflection. But we see both sides. We're talking about Trojan horse. In Trieste, they probably don't think it's Trojan horse, but it's an opportunity for the port. And so I think something we need to elaborate on, and also we need to elaborate on trade. And on trade, I see a paradox, is that finally, contrary to one could think, we are not so far from the US on substance. We know that there are problems. We're not denying that. We're not naive. But we disagree on method. We don't think that unilateralism, sanctions, trade wars are the answer. And that is something where we must find a common ground, which is in the multilateral framework, not outside of the multilateral framework. We must certainly reform WTO. We must not destroy WTO. You may think I'm far away from China. No, as a matter of fact, because that's the way we must try to find a ground to seize opportunities, but also to limit the risk to our sovereignty. But it's also due to things that we need to do for ourselves. We'll take another example. We were discussing that at lunch. The Balkans. The Balkans are waiting for us to welcome them. We are very slow at that. Very, very slow. In my view, too slow. I'm not advocating for any kind of enlargement, not because my father was Romanian origin and my mother Polish, and that makes me a good French, but a good European, first of all, but because I think that's our interest, historically, to have a strong union, a large union. But if we turn our back to the Balkans, if we don't finance their own development, how can we reproach them to come in the end of China? So we also need for ourselves to do our homework and to be capable of building a system which is attractive enough with our own financing And that's what, for example, the Juncker Plan was about. The Juncker Plan is a vehicle for investment of 500 billion euros. We need to do more, especially on climate. We probably need also to have our own sovereign instruments. We must not be naive, but it's not only about protecting ourselves. It's also about having strong weapons to react.
Great. There, I think you were, yeah. Yes?
Thank you. With regards to Brexit, I know if this deal that's been agreed to goes forward, it will go into a transition period where the next relationship will be clarified. Boris Johnson has, in the past, voiced support for a free trade agreement modeled on the Canada-EU agreement. However, that took 10 years to negotiate, and I think he might be a bit optimistic if he thinks that can be done in a few years. But I'm curious to hear, as Commissioner for Customs, what your thoughts are on that. Thank you.
Well, I'm not commenting on free trade, and I hope that a free trade agreement can be negotiated swiftly. It's probably not going to be as simple as some imagine, but we need again to design a very strong, close, friendly relationship with the UK. And I repeat my motto: if they're not anymore in the EU, they will be European. And we cannot deal with them as extra European partners, obviously. On customs, it was at the heart of the discussion on the deal, and especially the Irish question, the necessity not to reintroduce a physical border between Northern Ireland and Southern Ireland due to peace agreements that were signed some 20 and so years ago. And the principal position of the EU was always that the customs union rules should apply to Ireland. Finally, a solution has been found which is quite subtle, because at the same time, Northern Ireland will still be in the UK, but there will be also common understanding about control of goods between Northern Ireland and Ireland under the authority of the British authorities, but with a definition of some products by a joint committee in which the EU is present. That's a bit complex, but we have preserved our customs union. It's something which is absolutely decisive for us.
Thank you. Yes, over here. No.
Thank you. It's Nuclear Science Week. Can you tell me about the EU plans to deal with the waste from your nuclear reactors?
I'm afraid that's not my specialty as a
Well, you're
commissioner.
French, and you guys have lots of nuclear reactors.
That's another point. I want to react as I'm here as a commissioner. But
You don't have
the
to
only thing
react you don't have to react on
no, I will
reactors.
have to react maybe more globally. As I said, one of the priorities, if not the priority of the next Commission, will be to forge what we call a Green New Deal. And that means that we need to invest probably trillions of euro in order to have an economy which is carbon neutral by 2050, and to fight climate change by all means. And those nuclear aspects will have to be involved in that.
Where does the waste go now?
It depends on the countries, depends on the systems. I know where they go in France, and I know the debate.
Now, we're coming to the end. Let's gather questions. My goodness. Let's try. We've got a nice nucleus of 3 right here.
Just very briefly.
You want to the microphone? Thanks.
You mentioned the problem when you were talking about taxation of qualified majority voting. And earlier we heard discussions of China and so on. And I wonder if with the emergence and the longer that the Western Balkans aren't members, the longer perhaps this problem might grow more intense. I wonder if you could elaborate on the areas where this qualified majority voting might be relevant. That's a general question.
Just have a brief follow-up question on the Northern Irish issue. Bernd Lange, the chairman of the intercommittee this morning said on the new agreement that was reached that he's concerned that the fact that we have a single market barrier that is, or border that is essentially administered by British customs officials might create some trust issues as regards, sort of the protection of the single market from dumped goods coming into Ireland. Is that a concern that is that you are perhaps concerned about as well?
And that's her third, and then you get the...
Terry Sprackland with Tax Notes International. Going back to tax, you have a remarkable number of new directives that have been accepted, but are they being implemented in an even-handed way across all the member states? Some countries seem to be lagging in determination to implement. And what can the Commission do about that?
Well, there are three disparate questions. Well,
On QMV, to a general question, I will give a general answer. Progressively, QMV is becoming the general decision-making rule of the EU. And there are very few items now where it has to move to QMV. I would mention three, and all the three of them were addressed by this Commission, especially in Jean-Claude Juncker's speech on the State of the Union, because we've imported that from you in Europe, in the European Parliament. And there are foreign policy, tax policy, social policy. Obviously, these are three matters which are delicate, because they are matters of sovereignty. But there are other matters of sovereignty which have moved from unanimity to QMV. So this argument in sovereign is not enough to deny that. But we need to find a balance. And my view is that we certainly need to address the issue progressively, not to have from scratch, for example, on tax, every issue moving to QMV, but starting with some which are more a source of a consensus. Let's imagine tax fraud and tax avoidance, and then moving to more delicate issues, for example, energy or digital. And I proposed a plan, a 5-year plan, which was not adopted from now by the Council of Ministers. Don't forget that the Commission proposes, but the ministers decide. We are, I would say, the closest body looking like a government in Europe, but we are not the government of Europe. That's a very important point. So, and this kind of approach could be generalized and also applied to foreign policy and to social policy, because we need to acclimate it, the member states to that. If you put them directly in that, they will obviously refuse. I understand the question raised by Bernd Lange. One easy response would be to say, I'm not in Brussels, I'm in Washington for the IMF meetings. There is a lot of jet lag, so that would be too easy. I don't mean that I'm sleepy. I mean that I could say I've not read everything and I've not seen all those declarations, but that's not exactly true. This is a question, a legitimate question, that the debate, as well in the UK and in the European Parliament, because you need also to have an agreement by the European Parliament, will have to address. I think this is properly addressed, since I recalled a few minutes ago the role of a joint committee for the definition of products that wouldn't be submitted to the control of Her Royal Majesty's customs. But the way things are physically designed gives to these customs an important role. But I can understand that the committee, the intercommittee, which I've been attending to a lot of times as a customs commissioner, ask questions and even wants to precise the deal. And so that's fully legitimate. On implementation is not a major problem. What is a major problem sometimes is delays, is that there is a lot of time between the vote of a directive and the implementation itself. But globally, I don't see a problem of implementation. I don't see on a directive that is already implemented this other country saying, I'm not implementing it. And we've got, of course, all legal resources. The courts are there for that, to have this applied. And so, no, there is no problem of implementation. But the problem is that our legislation is slow to implement. Because since we are 27 or 28 member states, it needs to be implemented everywhere. But things go with a speed. It's the same for Brexit. It takes some time, but finally it's done. I would just mention one point, is that I've been proposing, and it was adopted, a directive on intermediaries for transparency. Intermediaries are lawyers, tax advisors, financial advisors, accountants, and that now they have to declare the aggressive planning schemes they sell to their client to their tax administration. It's going to enter into force early 2020. It's not late. It's going to be implemented everywhere. So one could say your legislation is too slow to implement. I can accept that. I don't think that one can say our legislation is not properly implemented when times come.
Great, thank you so much. Sadly, we're out of time and we need to respect the commissioner's schedule, which is tight. I just want to say one word I should have said at the outset. To first, thank the Careers in Diplomacy Club who helped organize this session. We're very grateful to our friends at the EU Embassy, and you should all be very grateful because they supplied you lunch, which was, if the quality of the lunch compared to normal here is a good indication, I think that's a great endorsement.
I'm not going to comment on
Don't
that
have
because
to.
Everything can be relative, but I want to thank the EU Embassy for lunch.
It's a great endorsement for the standards of the European Union. But I should say, lest you think it's gold-plated, my colleagues tell me we were now going to use the same caterers going forward. So let's call this an element of structural reform. But more broadly, and more to the point, please join me in thanking the Commissioner for his generosity.